When I was around 13, I started spending time with a group of boys, and we formed a tight-knit crew that went on regular long hikes in the mountains surrounding Seattle. We were part of the Boy Scouts, but quickly grew into a splinter group that sought more freedom and risk than what the formal scout trips offered. It was our version of expeditions. The group usually consisted of 5 of us: Mike, Rocky, Rayleigh, Danny and me. Mike, being a few years older and far more experienced, led the way. Over a span of about 3 years, we hiked hundreds of miles together. We explored the Olympic National Forest, Glacier Peak Wilderness, and the Pacific Coast. Many times we'd venture out for 7 or more days at a time, navigating through old-growth forests and across rocky beaches. The weather in the Pacific Northwest was often cold and wet, making it tough on our gear, but we embraced the challenge. The hikes weren't dangerous beyond the fact that we were teenagers in the wilderness, hours from help and without the technology of today. We grew into a confident, tight-knit team. After a long day of hiking, we'd pick a camping spot, and without much discussion, we'd get to work. Mike and Rocky would set up the tarp, Danny would gather wood, and Riley and I would work together to get the fire going. Our meals were simple but satisfying: Spam mixed with hamburger helper, and in the mornings, things like carnation instant breakfast or a powdered version of a Western omelette. We ate out of empty 10 coffee cans, which doubled as our cooking vessels and water pails. I still remember the creation of our hot raspberry drink, a simple combination of Jell-O mix and boiling water. What really stood out to me about those hikes, though, was the sense of autonomy. We were making our own decisions, living free from adult supervision. At school, none of us were the popular kids. Danny played basketball, but gave it up to hike with us. I was the skinniest and often the coldest of the group, and I always felt like I was weaker than the others. But despite this, I thrived on the physical challenge and the freedom the trips gave me. These hikes were about testing our limits, figuring out who we were, and experimenting with identities. It was during this time that I started to feel a clear sense of longing to figure out what my path would be, something meaningful and consequential, though I didn't yet know exactly what that would look like. In parallel to our hiking adventures, I was also spending a lot of time with a different group of boys: Kent, Paul, and Rick. We all went to the same school, Lakeside, and it was here that we gained access to a mainframe computer. This was incredibly rare at the time. The 4 of us quickly became absorbed in writing increasingly sophisticated programs, and in many ways this became another type of adventure for me. Unlike hiking, programming was not about physical challenges, but it was just as exploratory. It gave me the chance to carve my own path, and the logic and stamina required to write long programs felt natural to me. In that group, I was the leader, taking charge in ways that I hadn't with my hiking friends. Toward the end of my sophomore year in June 1971, Mike called me with a new hiking plan: 50 miles in the Olympic Mountains, taking the Press Expedition Trail. This was a challenging route, and the snow had been heavy that year, making it particularly daunting. But the rest of the group was up for it, so I felt like I had no choice but to join in. The plan was to climb the Low Divide Pass, descend to the Quinault River, and then retrace our steps. The first day was easy, but the snow grew deeper as we climbed, and when we reached our planned shelter, it was buried in snow. Mike gave us 2 options: backtrack or continue on to our final destination. After Danny voted to press on, we decided to keep going. I remember that day vividly, how cold and miserable it was. But what stands out the most is what happened next. As I trudged through the snow, I began to retreat into my thoughts and mentally worked on the formula evaluator I'd been developing for a computer program. This wasn't just any hike. We had recently gotten a PDP-8, a small computer that could be used by one person, unlike the massive mainframes we were used to. The PDP-8 was an early example of the personal computer, and I decided to write a version of the basic programming language for it. The formula evaluator was a feature that would help a computer perform operations in a formula, things like 3 to 5 by 8 minus 3. As we hiked, I mentally traced the steps of my program, working out how to make it as lean as possible to conserve the computer's limited memory. The PDP-8 had just 6 kilobytes of memory, so every line of code had to count. The rhythm of walking helped me think, much like how I would rock back and forth when pondering something. Throughout the rest of the hike, I was consumed by coding, even though my body was moving through the rugged terrain. By the end of the hike, I had mentally crafted a clean and efficient version of my code. It was, to that point, the best program I had written. The elation I felt when we finished the hike, with the hard work behind me, was something I rarely experienced in everyday life. By the time school started again that fall, the PDP-8 was gone, and I hadn't finished my basic project. But the code I'd written during that hike, especially the formula evaluator, stayed with me. 3.5 years later, in college, I wasn't sure where my life was headed when Paul burst into my dorm room with news of a groundbreaking new computer. I knew immediately we could write a basic language for it. I dug into my memory and pulled out the evaluator code I had written during that hike. I typed it up, and with that, I planted the seed for what would become a huge part of my future. That code, honed in the mountains, helped set the foundation for one of the world's largest companies and a new industry. Trey. There was a point in my life when software programs would span millions of lines of code, powering billions of devices around the globe. A time when I would need to worry about staying at the cutting edge of a technology industry filled with competitors. Before any of that, I had one very simple goal: overcome my grandmother at cards. My family took games seriously, and that made my grandmother, Gamey as we called her, a legend in our home. She and her mother, whom we knew as Lala, both played an impressive amount of bridge. Their skill made them formidable opponents, and by the time I was 5, Gami was teaching me all the essentials through endless hands of Go Fish, Rummy, Sevens, and a quick-fire group version of Solitaire called Pounce. She always won, and for years I assumed that some hidden gift or a higher power gave her these victories. Then one day, I saw that she was tracking cards and patterns in a methodical way, effectively using her memory and logic to see moves I never noticed. This was my first glimpse of how practice, focus, and training your brain can turn any mystery, such as a deck of cards, into something you can solve. By the time I was around 10, I started to win more often. Her cheer and confidence in me never wavered. It was all part of her gentle but unrelenting push to help me see that anything could be figured out. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own quirks and challenges as a child, rocking back and forth so my mind could latch on to whatever problem interested me that day. My parents, my father, Bill Gates Jr., and my mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, spent a lot of energy figuring out how to raise a boy who cared intensely about the things that grabbed his attention, and not at all about the usual routines of life or school. My father was a tall, calm man who served in the army during the last year of the Second World War. Afterward, he went to the University of Washington on the GI Bill, earning both his undergraduate and law degrees. He was measured, polite, and purposeful, but he would also push for what he wanted. My mother was more outgoing, a natural connector who loved bringing people together and who thrived when placed in the spotlight. Their backgrounds were almost opposites. My mother's side, the Maxwells, enjoyed a well-off upbringing that traced back to my great-grandfather, who rose from digging basements to becoming a respected banker and civic leader. My father's side, the Gates family in Bremerton, came out of modest circumstances, running a small furniture store. My grandfather had grown up working odd jobs and owned that store until the anxiety of finances grew into a kind of life philosophy: stay safe and protect what you have. This often clashed with my father's hunger to go beyond what he had known. He found a role model in the boy next door, whose father was a high-energy entrepreneur and later mayor of Seattle, a man who showed him there were no personal limits to what you could accomplish. My father and mother first met in the student government at the University of Washington. She was the go-getter with big campaigns and wide social networks. He was more behind the scenes, fighting for free speech on campus. At first, he wanted her help finding a dance partner until she informed him that he already had one. Her. They married in 1951 after resolving differences that came from growing up in two very different worlds. My mother wrote letters explaining how their shared values, being honest, fair and driven to succeed, would be the glue that held them together. They wanted children who would carry forward those values. They started married life in Bremerton, where my mother taught junior high, while my father handled divorces and municipal court cases. Then they moved to Seattle, so he could build his law career and she could be near her family. By the time I was born, we settled into a neighborhood called View Ridge in North Seattle. My older sister, Christy, and I would play in freshly poured sidewalks and watch new houses go up around us. I was a happy toddler, but I was also restless and sometimes contrary, especially when it came to everyday rules that my mother tried to enforce. Growing up in that household meant a mix of challenges and unlimited opportunities. My mother had a knack for organising campaigns, events and dinner parties. My father had the legal mind, steady but determined. Their lives, and eventually my sisters and mine, were shaped by strong-willed grandparents, games that taught us to read a room and think ahead, and a quiet understanding that our family name carried responsibilities and possibilities. Whenever I think back to those years, my mind still goes to Gamey. I hear her calm voice telling me to think carefully, to watch what others do, to put myself in the best position to win. That lesson would stay with me long after I first learned to shuffle a deck of cards, and it would be a central theme as my life's story turned from after-school card games to the creation of a company that would change the world. View Ridge. A loud bang shook the house on an evening when my mother was about to leave for dinner with my father. My sister Christy and I were at home with the babysitter. We saw our carport roof fly over the house and crash in the backyard. That was the day a tornado appeared in our neighborhood, the first on record in Seattle. As frightening as it was, no one was hurt, and the main damage on our street was limited to our carport. A reporter took a photo of one of our neighbours climbing on the debris, and my mother clipped the article and pasted it into her scrapbook. My father wanted to turn it into a light-hearted moment by hosting a barbecue and giving friends a glimpse of the wreckage, but my mother felt it would be out of place for our family to celebrate what could have ended in tragedy. That happened in 1962, the same era in which our home was stocked with supplies in case of a nuclear attack. World events felt tense, but for most people in our North Seattle neighborhood, the mood was one of faith in progress. America was booming, newly built homes were springing up, schools were expanding, and parents who had served in World War II and gone to college on the GI Bill were settling into prosperous suburban lives. The contrasting reality was that Seattle, like much of the country, remained segregated. Our neighborhood's racial covenants had only recently been ruled unenforceable, so families of color were still limited to living in other parts of the city. In the midst of this optimism, the 1962 World's Fair, called Century 21, was promoted as a triumphant display of technological and scientific progress. Visitors saw mock-ups of future space travel, early computers, and concept cars powered by nuclear energy. My parents and I went multiple times, riding the Wild Mouse roller coaster, sampling Belgian waffles, and marveling at the new Space Needle. My mother dressed me up in a blue blazer for the occasion, and I remember loving the carnival rides more than anything to do with computers. Even so, I absorbed the broader theme of the future as a place of grand possibility. My daily life revolved around home, school, and routines. View Ridge Elementary was close enough for me and my sister to walk. She was the punctual, responsible older sibling who had no trouble following rules. I was the smaller, more easily distracted child, often lost in a book. My parents made sure teachers knew how different I was from my sister. Both my mother and father wanted us to excel, but they handled it by quietly setting high expectations and offering small rewards. My mother would invite our teachers to dinner so they could discuss our progress and learn more about us. I found it embarrassing as a child, but it was simply part of her dedication to making our family function at its best. Even so, my parents had busy lives outside the house. My mother, Mary, volunteered for organisations such as the Junior League and the group that would later be called the United Way. My father, Bill Gates Jr., worked for a law firm known for its thorough approach to litigation. Over dinner, they gave us glimpses of what it was like to engage in a world of civic responsibilities and local politics. We often heard about the struggles of cleaning up Lake Washington or the work it took to pass school levies. They believed in improving the community and expected us to pitch in, even as children. Away from school and volunteer meetings, summer often meant 2 weeks at Cheerio Lodge cottages on the Hood Canal. Several families, many of them close friends of my parents, would gather every year for swimming, boating, grilling, and long games of capture the flag. My father dubbed himself the mayor of Cheerio, leading packs of children in games and ending each night with a train of kids marching behind him to our cabins. We held a small Olympics that included sack races, egg balancing contests, and a torch lighting ceremony. Our mother devised a dinner exchange where children would eat with someone else's parents, forcing us to socialize outside our usual comfort zone. Back in Seattle, Christmas demanded precise planning worthy of a major production. My mother took notes after each holiday to avoid repeating anything that did not go well. My father used his jigsaw to craft elaborate decorations, such as the life-sized plywood Santa we called Big Santa. In early November, we began making Christmas cards by hand, often with a clever poem or puzzle. We hosted a roller skating party that included personalized invitations cut into the shape of tiny skates or assembled like a crossword puzzle. My mother ordered matching pajamas for everyone in the family, always stepping up the traditions another notch. We opened presents from oldest to youngest, one person at a time, though it felt like it took hours. When all the gifts were cleared away, my mother took her notes for the following year, planning how to improve her holiday system even further. Those habits of organised celebrations, civic volunteer work, and continual improvement defined much of my childhood. My parents found joy in their busy schedules and used their friendships and commitments to shape my sisters and me into the kind of people they admired. My father was known for an even temper and a commitment to justice, influenced by what he had seen during the war and his law practice. My mother had a drive to create community bonds, push us forward, and make every tradition a memory to cherish. Their example made me aware from early on that family life could reflect a bigger world of responsibilities, friendships, and lifelong learning. Rational. In the summer of 1963, just after I finished second grade, my mom, grandmother, Christy, and I packed into the car for what we called the Disneyland trip. But this trip wasn't just about visiting the iconic theme park, it was about learning. My mom, always the teacher, saw this as an opportunity to instill knowledge in us during our 1,000-mile drive to Los Angeles. We started our trip at exactly 8:15 a.m., the time my mom had carefully timed. She had recently bought a high-tech IBM Selectric typewriter, which had interchangeable metal balls to change the font, including cursive, which I thought was amazing. She prepared a travel log for us, 2 pages a day, with headings to fill in like landforms, weather, population distribution, land use, and more. Every day we would record what we saw: apple orchards, oil wells, bridges, and historical sites like Hearst Castle and the Golden Gate Bridge. Each night in the motel, Christy would write our observations and my mom would review them with her red pen, correcting grammar and spelling. Meanwhile, I jotted down extra notes in my own notebook. Through these daily journals, my mom was teaching us geography, geology, history, and even math, while also training us to pay attention to the world around us. These logs are why I know the difference between stalactites and stalagmites, and why I still remember the exact number of steps to reach the top of the Washington State Capitol Rotunda. After 4 days of traveling, we reached Los Angeles, and my dad joined us. We told him all about the horse we had been reading about, Man o' War, who had broken endurance and speed records. In some ways, it felt like my mom was on a mission similar to that of the horse, driving us forward with her lessons. Around the same time, I became more aware of my grandmother's Christian Science beliefs. While she lived her life with a rigid routine, meals at set times, swimming in all weather, there was one thing I didn't understand. She refused to go to the hospital, relying instead on Christian Science practitioners to heal through prayer. This was particularly confusing when Christy broke her arm. While my grandmother called a practitioner, we eventually had to take Christy to the hospital to get her arm casted. A year later, I had a close call myself when I developed appendicitis, and Gamey did get me to the hospital just in time for surgery. My family practiced religion more as an intellectual exercise. My parents, though they had left Christian Science, still attended a congregational church in Seattle, led by a progressive minister, Reverend Dale Turner. He was known for supporting civil rights and gay rights, and even though my dad had distanced himself from religion, my mom believed in exposing us to its moral lessons. Sunday school was an activity I did, but not something I thought deeply about. I memorized the Sermon on the Mount for a dinner at the Space Needle, and while I internalized some of the lessons, to me it was more about the mental challenge than the spiritual one. Books were always my escape. At a young age, I dove into our set of World Book encyclopedias, reading almost every volume and learning about everything from geography to science. I found a particular fascination with penguins, rockets and bridges, though I quickly realized that while I could draw designs for these things, I had no idea how they worked. The gap between imagination and reality frustrated me, but it also sparked my desire to learn more. At school, my interests set me apart. Reading for fun, asking questions, and excelling in subjects like math and science wasn't considered cool. I realized early that many of my classmates didn't share my curiosity. I also noticed that my tendency to get lost in books and ideas made me seem different from others, which led me to question why I had to follow the same rules. My mom, concerned about my social life, encouraged me to get involved more. So at 8 years old, I joined Cub Scouts, where the annual nut sale became a real challenge for me. Each boy had to sell 100 pounds of nuts, and though it felt daunting, I found a competitive spark in the task. With my dad's help, I ventured into wealthy neighbourhoods, knocking on doors, and by the end of the sale, I had sold 179 pounds of nuts. I may not have won the top prize, but the sense of accomplishment stayed with me. By 4th grade, I was an energetic, inquisitive kid, asking endless questions and often disrupting the class. My teacher, Mrs. Carlson, did her best to keep up with me, even after class, explaining things that piqued my interest. One day I wrote a humorous story about her hair turning pink after using hairspray that had been replaced with spray paint. Mrs. Carlson was good-natured about it, and the class loved it. Humour was becoming my way of getting attention in class. I also began to question the rules at school. For example, I didn't understand the grading system. Why should effort be graded separately? To me, an A with minimal effort should be the best grade. When I voiced my thoughts, my teacher didn't take me seriously, but the idea stuck with me. Why do things have to follow conventional rules? In my free time, I grew fascinated by the human body and physiology. I took a cow's lung to school for show and tell, to demonstrate how lungs work by showing how the lung could still push air in and out, even after being removed. It shocked my classmates, and one girl even fainted. Mrs. Carlson made me take the lung outside to avoid further discomfort. Math, however, was where I really excelled. I realised I could finish multiplication problems faster than anyone else in class. And math gave me the certainty I craved. It felt like a system I could master, and I started to gain confidence in my intellect. But as I became more confident, I also became more rebellious. By the time I was 9, I started questioning the authority of my parents and teachers. I didn't see why I had to follow their rules if I could think for myself. This shift didn't go unnoticed by my mom, who was concerned about my lack of interest in socializing and my resistance to responsibility. Her solution was to have me join more structured activities, which led me to Cub Scouts, but I struggled to see the value in them. The librarian at my new school quickly recognized my need for intellectual stimulation and put me to work as a library assistant. I loved the job and felt important. I even started memorizing the Dewey Decimal System and became deeply involved in organizing the library, which felt like a game I could master. I spent hours in the library, feeling valued for my contributions and exploring books that sparked my curiosity. Later that year, after a family dinner, my parents surprised Christy and me with the news that my mom was pregnant. Along with the news came the inevitable change. We needed more space, and so we would move to a new house. I protested the move, especially because it meant leaving my library assistant job behind. But my mom made sure to thank my beloved librarian, Mrs. Caffier, by inviting her to dinner. Eventually, I moved to the new house, but my attachment to books and learning only grew stronger, even in the midst of all the changes. Lucky kid. From 5th grade on, every morning started with the familiar tune of my mom singing, "Good morning to you." The song echoed through the intercom connecting our bedrooms with the kitchen, where she was always busy making breakfast. While it may have seemed extravagant to have an intercom system, my mom saw it as a time saver, allowing her to keep things running smoothly without skipping a beat. After our move to Laurelhurst, my mom's influence expanded, and she began rising through the ranks of the corporate world, often becoming the first woman on the boards of major companies. She would leave the house each day, impeccably dressed and briefcase in hand, headed to meetings or working late into the night, drafting proposals or writing thank you letters for various projects. Despite her busy schedule, she was always engaged as a mother, striking a balance that few others in our social circle could manage. My sisters and I were keenly aware that our mom was unconventional. She wasn't the typical housewife of the time. In the mid-1960s, at a time when Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was sparking change, my mom was already living a different reality, one where ambition and motherhood weren't mutually exclusive. As a result, she became a local icon of balance and success. My sister Libby even nominated her for a Mother of the Year award, highlighting how, despite her busy schedule, Mom was always there for things like bowling or playing tennis and always supported us at our events. My father, for his part, was incredibly supportive of my mother's ambitions. His attitude towards gender roles was ahead of his time. He imagined a world where there were no distinctions between men and women, where both had equal access to careers and ambitions. This belief aligned with how he treated my mom, always standing by her as she made waves in her professional life. At Laurelhurst Elementary, I was the new kid. The fear of not fitting in was real. I quickly observed the social hierarchy of the school, with the toughest kids at the top, followed by the athletic types, then the brainy kids, and at the bottom, the nerds. I didn't identify as any of those, so I found a different way to fit in: humour. I became the class clown, making jokes and goofing around to deflect attention from the fact that I was socially awkward. I pretended to not care about school, wallowing in disorganisation and neglecting my schoolwork until the last minute. However, despite my efforts to downplay my intelligence, I was always drawn to knowledge. I started attending speech therapy sessions to work on my voice. I was told I might need to repeat a grade, but my parents decided against it. I thought, if the experts don't know what to do with me, why should I care about their advice? This rebellious attitude was only getting stronger, and by the time I met Boomer, a fellow contrarian and someone who mirrored my intellectual curiosity, I had found a true friend. Boomer was fearless, always willing to challenge any position, and it was through our debates that I began to engage more seriously with topics like the Vietnam War. We both argued for the pro-war side in a school debate, simply to take on the challenge, which we won thanks to Boomer's political conservatism and my growing research skills. At home, our new house in Laurelhurst was set into a hill with a view of Mount Rainier from the back deck. Despite my personal messiness, my mother was determined to instill a sense of order in me. She started charging me 25 cents every time I left clothes on the floor, but it didn't deter me much. I was happiest when I could retreat to my room, filled with books, and spend time thinking through ideas, whether it was the mystery of sound travel or the complexities of math. I remember working through school project, blissfully ignoring margins and details like formatting. To me, the ideas were what mattered, and the teacher's feedback about my unorthodox approach didn't faze me. Meanwhile, my parents continued to support my intellectual growth, even if my grades weren't great. My mother signed me up for everything from baseball to football, but none of it stuck. I didn't enjoy the physicality of organised sports, though I did find skiing and tennis interesting, thanks to my mom's own love for those activities. I also dabbled in music. My first attempts were with piano, then guitar, but eventually I ended up lugging a trombone around for 2 years before quitting. There was one activity, though, that I actually took to, the paper route, which I did for a short time, though it was more of a chore than a passion. In the midst of these activities, my parents signed me up for a class on parent effectiveness training, hoping to find new strategies to handle my rebellious nature. At one point, my behaviour became so difficult that my dad, a normally calm man, threw a glass of water at me during a dinner argument. I was shocked, as it was the first time I had seen him lose his temper. At that point, my parents turned to Dr. Charles Cressy, a social worker, for guidance. My whole family attended the first session, but it was clear that I was the reason we were there. Dr. Cressy was unlike any therapist I had ever imagined. Calm, empathetic, and genuinely interested in me as a person, not just a patient. Through his questions and insights, I began to realise that my parents loved me, and that their methods, even when they didn't seem to make sense to me, were motivated by love. Over time, I started to change my approach, focusing more on understanding my parents' perspective rather than fighting them. Things slowly improved after my sessions with Dr. Cressy. I gained more independence and began to see my parents as allies in my journey, rather than adversaries. My parents also started giving me more freedom, understanding that I wasn't like other kids and that I needed space to figure things out on my own. The turning point came when I was sent to a new school, Lakeside, an exclusive private school in Seattle. I was initially resistant to the idea, but when I took the entrance exam, my competitive spirit kicked in and I passed. Meanwhile, my parents continued to feed my intellectual curiosity. We took a family trip to the East Coast, visiting historic sites and museums in Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston. This trip was part celebration and part preparation for my transition to Lakeside. At Lakeside, I began to truly thrive. I became more engaged in the intellectual life of the school, eventually starting a club with some of my friends where we debated current issues like the Vietnam War. We even took field trips to local think tanks and non-profits, which expanded my understanding of the world and how smart people collaborate to solve big problems. This period of my life was marked by growth and change, as I learned how to channel my curiosity and rebelliousness into something more constructive. Lakeside. On my first day of 7th grade, I remember thinking Lakeside School was mislabeled. It was nowhere near a lake, just a wooded campus off Interstate 5 on the far northern edge of Seattle. It was originally on Lake Washington, which explained the name, but in the 1930s they moved it to build something bigger and more like an East Coast prep school. Manicured lawns, brick columns, and a prominent bell tower. By the time I arrived in the fall of 1967, some of those old-fashioned rules were fading, but there were still strict traditions, including assigned seating at lunch and a male-only faculty, aside from the librarian. I felt out of place at first. Many of my new classmates had known each other for years. They joined the football team or grabbed roles in the newspaper or drama club, and they seemed confident about finding their fit. I fell back on my usual clown routine, hoping people might accept me if I acted like I did not care about grades. It worked poorly. In geography class, the teacher paired me with the student whose grades were worse than mine. For the first time, I realized a teacher saw me only as a goof-off. Trying to prove myself, I delivered a massive report on the Black Sea, copied from encyclopedias, but not truly my own work. That earned a low grade. By the year's end, I wrote a snarky farewell message in my yearbook to all my teachers, feeling that I was underachieving in a school where no one bought into my act. If I had paid closer attention, I would have noticed a short blurb in the Lakeside newspaper that spring. It announced that, come fall, the math department would connect to a computer. At that moment, I had no idea it would change my life. In 8th grade, I met a new friend, Kent Evans. He had unruly brown hair, a pronounced cleft lip from difficult surgeries, and a fearlessness that made him unique. He did not care what anyone thought of him. He loved politics and dove passionately into the roiling events of 1968. He knocked on doors for Hubert Humphrey, engaged in the heated debates of that year, and managed to get himself elected to our student senate. Kent studied the lives of famous leaders in hopes of plotting out his own future. Together, we devoured biographies of Roosevelt, MacArthur, and Napoleon, then spent hours talking about whether we should become generals, ambassadors, or lawyers. He was the first person who pushed me to think about my ambitions in a long-term way. Meanwhile, Lakeside's new computer terminal had arrived. It was only a teletype machine connected by phone to a real computer far away. Our math teacher, Fred Wright, ran the room with a loose hand, letting us stay as long as we wanted. He believed in giving students space to explore, so that room became our domain. My friend Kent and I began competing with two older kids, Paul Allen and Rick Wyland, both of them in 10th grade. Paul was especially good at provoking me by saying, "You think you are so smart, see if you can figure this out." It got me working furiously to learn programming faster than any of the bigger kids. A new language named BASIC made it possible to pick up coding with no formal background. I wrote a tic-tac-toe game, then expanded to a lunar lander simulation. The computer was completely unforgiving. One tiny error and the whole program failed. Yet every time I got something right, it was electrifying. We all raced to push the machine in new directions, programming games, trying to teach it Monopoly, writing code that generated random sentences from made-up nouns and verbs. So many teachers had told me to rein in my excess energy. But here, no one ever said that. It felt like the perfect place for someone who wanted to throw himself headlong into solving problems. Our only roadblock was cost. Every minute spent online ate into the money raised by the Lakeside Mothers Club rummage sale. We needed a better arrangement, and it arrived through a remarkable parent, a woman named Monique Rona. She was French, had survived World War II, and later studied math. While driving the morning carpool, she learned how excited I was about computers and realized she could help. She was launching a company called Computer Center Corporation, C-Cubed, to lease a powerful new DC computer for time sharing with various businesses. C-Cubed needed to test that system before going live, so they recruited us to try and break their computer. The more bugs we found, the longer they could delay paying fees to digital equipment. The result was free access for a bunch of restless teenage boys who wanted nothing more than to push a computer to its limits. That was our ticket to nearly unlimited time on one of the era's most advanced machines. The same pattern continued from the school's teletype to C-Cubed's office. We wrote programs, found errors, documented them, and learned even more in the process. It was the most thrilling kind of education, one led by curiosity, challenge, and a deep competitive streak among friends. And, unknown to all of us, those steps would lead to an entire world of software, companies, and careers yet to be imagined. Free time. Monique Rona's new computer company operated in a building that used to be a car dealership, and for a time it became our paradise. Kent, Paul, Rick, and I turned up day after day, sometimes far into the night. We tested the huge system, documented any crash, and gained as many hours at the terminal as possible. That winter brought heavy snowfall, which meant unexpected school closures that we seized for more coding. It felt like we were racing against time, sure that we would be kicked out eventually. I even started sneaking out of my house to catch a late bus and walk the final blocks to the computer lab, returning in the early hours of the morning without my parents realizing what I had done. Our good fortune was thanks to Monique, who believed that teenagers could be capable and resourceful. She herself had faced challenges growing up in wartime France and likely saw potential in a group of kids who just needed access. We were young with no formal training, yet we were learning through constant trial and error. If we stumbled on a bug, we let the system operators know, and that was exactly what they wanted. We stayed long after everyone else left, living on pizza from a nearby cafe and refining our skills. Soon this became my normal pattern. Deep focus on one program after another, trying a solution, waiting for the machine's response, and trying again. With so few books available, we scavenged for any scrap of professional code. Late at night, Paul or I would hop into the dumpster outside the building, fishing out crumpled printouts showing advanced instructions in machine language. We studied them line by line, filling the gaps with anything we could glean from C-Cubed programmers. I used BASIC to make small recipe programs or toy battles, imagining huge simulated armies, each with realistic odds of success or failure. Then our luck ran out, the company moved on from its testing phase, and we were no longer welcome as free explorers. Worse, the moment we tried a sneaky trick to get extra time, we were caught and banned. That summer, without my usual access to computers, I returned to Boy Scout activities. One of the older scouts, Mike Collier, led a small expedition on the old life-saving trail along the coastline of Vancouver Island. I joined a handful of others, climbing rope ladders, wading through bogs, and ferrying ourselves over rivers on improvised rafts. Rain and difficult terrain tested us constantly, but the sense of accomplishment was enormous. Back home, we gathered at our long-time vacation spot on the Hood Canal, a place called Cheerio, where I alternated between the traditions my family cherished, races, silliness and games, and a new self-awareness. In that same summer, I found myself at times a leader among younger kids, and at other times, as always, the class clown in school. There were glimpses of a bigger academic future. My math scores placed me above nearly all the older students, and word got around that Gates, the Joker, might actually be talented. Even so, I was stuck in mandatory study hall while my best friend Kent was in free study with the other high achievers. At Cheerio, I decided something needed to change. I wanted to prove I belonged among the people who took their work seriously. I saw mathematics as the purest reflection of intelligence and decided that if I pushed myself in that field, I could push myself in every other subject. The following school year, everything would be different. Just kids? At Lakeside, students had to purchase all their own books, which meant a trip to the school's bookstore, where Joe Nix, the night watchman and book clerk, would gather your books. When I first showed up with my class schedule, I had a plan. I ordered 2 copies of each book, one for home and one for school. The goal wasn't to be prepared, it was to look effortlessly smart. I figured I could leave the books at home and show up at school without the burden of textbooks, all while secretly doing the work at home. I was trying to maintain my cool facade, but I was also beginning to realize that when I truly concentrated, my brain worked like a well-oiled machine, sorting facts and ideas into logical frameworks. This ability to hyper-focus was new for me. If I applied myself, I could easily absorb information and organize it into something meaningful. But I wasn't always disciplined. Biology, for example, bored me. We dissected planarians in 9th grade, and it felt pointless. The teacher didn't explain how these creatures fit into the grand picture of biology, and I struggled to see the relevance. My mind wanted to understand the bigger picture, and biology felt too disconnected to make sense of it. But that changed later. As I grew older, I came to appreciate the beauty of biology and its connection to the world. In 9th grade, I earned straight A's, a milestone I thought was a breakthrough. But looking back at my transcript, I saw a mix of A's and B's, a reminder that my mental discipline was still evolving. Even so, my hard work paid off. My mom, who had often worried about how much time I spent alone in my room, finally saw a payoff for my efforts. I wasn't just hiding away anymore. I was truly engaging in my learning. Once I started showing my teachers that I was genuinely curious and wanted to learn, I began to thrive. The teachers at Lakeside saw that I was capable, and they pushed me to prove myself. My physics teacher, Gary Maestretti, was particularly influential. He helped me see science not as a collection of memorized facts, but as a way of thinking about the world. He told us about the turn of the 20th century when physicists believed they had solved most of the big questions in their field. But then new discoveries, like Einstein's theory of relativity, shattered the old ideas and introduced us to a much stranger universe. As I moved into chemistry, my interest in science deepened. Dr. Daniel Morris, a former industrial chemist with a PhD in organic chemistry, taught me to look at the world through a scientific lens. He explained how seemingly simple things like glue worked. The glue's stickiness, he said, came from molecules that wanted to bond but were held apart by trace ingredients. It was when the glue was squeezed that those inhibitors were neutralized, allowing the molecules to bond and stick. Dr. Morris was a role model for how I envisioned a life in science. Curious, open-minded, and with a wide range of interests. He wasn't just a scientist. He played the clarinet, directed a choir, and even studied the geometry of the fourth dimension. His curiosity and passion for knowledge were infectious. Despite my growing love for science, my high school years were also marked by my involvement with computers. My friend Paul and I had been working on a war simulation program, and after C-Cubed, the company we had worked with, shut down, we found ourselves at a crossroads. Paul managed to get us back into C-Cubed, where we continued working on the program. But soon, we learned that the company had failed to secure enough customers, and the venture folded. This loss of access to computers was frustrating, but it pushed me to pivot. I began reading the New Testament to try to understand my own beliefs. I had gone through Sunday school and confirmation, but I was still unsure. So, I read the Bible and books on Christianity to help make sense of it all. The project I handed in was a mix of my war simulation and my analysis of the Bible, an ambitious but imperfect attempt to express my thoughts on religion. In the summer, I went on a hiking trip with friends. The trip, filled with adventures and mishaps, brought back memories of simpler times. One night, while on the boat with my friend Kent, we spent the days reading, swimming, and playing games like Stocks and Bonds, a game that introduced us to the concepts of the stock market. Kent and I both felt a growing interest in business and programming, and he encouraged me to read business magazines like Fortune and the Wall Street Journal. Kent, inspired by his great-grandfather's success in business, dreamed of finding his own path to riches. Kent and I, alongside our friend Rick, started a small programming group, pretending to be a company to get free brochures from various businesses. We even got into the business of creating programs. Our first big project was a payroll system for a company called Information Sciences, Inc. They didn't pay us, but it was an educational opportunity. We had to learn COBOL, a language none of us knew, and soon discovered how complex the task was. We had to understand business concepts like taxes, deductions, and insurance. As the project dragged on, tensions within our group grew. Paul and Rick lost interest, and Kent and I became frustrated with their lack of commitment. Eventually, we decided to take control, and I became the one in charge of dividing up the work and setting the deadlines. Kent also found a way to use the University of Washington's computer lab, and we spent hours there working on the project. After months of hard work, we presented the payroll program to ISI, and they took us seriously. It was a thrilling moment, as we realized that we had created something of value. We even negotiated royalties for our future projects. The project wasn't perfect, but it was a significant achievement for a group of high school students. Looking back, I realized that our involvement with computers during high school marked the beginning of our path into the tech world. The lessons I learned about perseverance, teamwork, and intellectual curiosity shaped the person I would become. It was a time of growth and discovery, not just in programming, but in understanding the world and my place in it. The real world. Kent was pacing around my family's living room, his frustration boiling over. It was a few weeks into our junior year, and I was just shy of my 16th birthday. Kent had a problem with ISI, a company that had promised us free computer time for all the work we'd put into a program we were developing. But now, they were refusing to honour their promise. Kent was ready to take legal action. He believed that my father, who was a lawyer, could help us out. My dad sat there quietly, hands folded, while Kent ranted, sure that a lawsuit would solve everything. Kent's intensity was something I had gotten used to over the years. Whether it was about unfair treatment or an issue he felt strongly about, he would blow up, often over the smallest of slights. This time, though, he was serious. My dad listened patiently, asking questions about the contract we had signed with ISI. After listening to Kent, my dad calmly picked up the phone and called the president of ISI. He simply said, "I hear you," after listening to the man's arguments. That was all it took. The president agreed to give us the computer time we had been promised. We were able to secure $5,000 worth of computer time, which was enough to complete our first software product. I was thrilled, not just because we had finally been compensated, but because we had built something that worked. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and that was a huge accomplishment for us. We were no longer just kids playing around with code. We had delivered a product that could be used by businesses to process payroll. The success with ISI wasn't the end of it, though. Kent immediately began pitching our services to other companies, including a science museum and an industrial electronics company. We even started a side project, programming for a company that studied traffic flow in Seattle. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was paying the bills. Meanwhile, Kent's entrepreneurial instincts continued to push him forward. He began hiring younger students from Lakeside to help us with some of the simpler tasks, and we expanded our business even further. Despite all the excitement, there was one instance when things almost took a turn for the worse. Kent had the idea to compete with ISI by offering discounts on their computer time. I wasn't comfortable with that. It felt unethical. Fortunately, our math teacher, Fred Wright, agreed with me and warned Kent that it wasn't a good idea. Kent dropped the plan. During this time, Lakeside was going through a major change. The school had recently merged with St. Nick's, and the integration of students was causing chaos. The scheduling system, which had been handled by our math teacher, Bob Haig, was a complete disaster. Kent and I took it upon ourselves to help fix the problem. We dug into the academic literature, researching how other schools solved scheduling problems, and tried to come up with a solution for Lakeside. By January of 1972, I had been working on the problem for months. I had started thinking about the issue in my free time, running different scheduling scenarios in my head. With snow days giving us more time to focus, I finally cracked the problem, creating a matrix that could handle the needs of students, teachers, and classrooms in a way that a computer could understand. Kent and I spent several sleepless nights at the University of Washington, working on the program using punch cards and a computer that was so slow that a single test run would take hours. But we were determined to get it done. Tragedy struck when, just before our deadline, Kent died in a climbing accident. He had been on a mountaineering trip to Mount Shuksan when he fell and was airlifted to the hospital where he passed away. I remember the phone call from our headmaster, Dan Eyrault, breaking the news. I couldn't believe it. Kent, my best friend, was gone. I spent the next few days in a daze trying to understand what had happened. His memorial service was a blur of people offering their condolences, but it wasn't until the reception afterward, when I saw Kent's parents, that the full weight of the loss hit me. They had lost their son, their future, and I was left with the grief of a friendship that had been cut short. In the days following Kent's death, I threw myself into finishing the class scheduling program. Paul, one of my friends from Lakeside, joined me in the effort, and we worked around the clock to meet the deadline. We spent hours coding, barely sleeping, and somehow managed to finish the program on time. It was a bittersweet victory, one that Kent would never see. But I knew that finishing it was something I had to do in his memory. During the summer, Paul and I continued to work together, and we forged a partnership that would define the rest of our lives. As we worked on new projects, Paul often talked about the advancements happening in the computer world, particularly the microprocessors being developed by a small company called Intel. The first microprocessor, the 4004, was limited in its capabilities, but it represented the future of computing. Paul believed that microprocessors would eventually make personal computers a reality. I was skeptical, but Paul's excitement was contagious. Later that year, we managed to get our hands on an Intel 8008 chip. It wasn't cheap, but it was the next step toward building the kind of computer we'd always dreamed of. Looking back, I can't help but laugh at how naive we were, but in that moment, we were excited. Little did we know that Intel's invention would set in motion a revolution that would shape the future of technology. That's when it really hit me. The microprocessor would change everything. It was the key to the personal computer revolution, and from that moment, the course of my life began to take shape. Without it, there would be no Microsoft. The rest, as they say, is history. 1 act and 5 nines. When I wrote my application essay for Harvard, I condensed my computer background into 600 words on my mom's old Selectric typewriter. I mentioned the different projects I'd worked on, from payroll programs to class schedules and automatic traffic counters. But I made it clear that despite all the fun I'd had with computers, I wasn't planning on continuing in the field. Instead, I expressed interest in business or law. A career in computers was a possibility, but the future of microprocessors and personal computers was still uncertain at that time. I wanted to explore other worlds, including government and politics, after spending a summer as a page at the House of Representatives. That time in Washington, D.C. was a whirlwind. It happened during the 1972 presidential race, when Thomas Eagleton's withdrawal from the McGovern ticket created a political drama I couldn't ignore. I even capitalized on it, buying campaign buttons before his resignation and selling them for a profit. The experience made me seriously consider law and politics as a career path. However, college was still my primary focus. My mom had high expectations for me, following the success of my sister Christy, who was excelling at the University of Washington. Harvard, in particular, felt like the ultimate goal, even if it wasn't explicitly said. Meanwhile, I was also dabbling in drama, surprising myself with how much I enjoyed it. I had signed up for the drama class again, and for our play, Black Comedy, I landed the lead role of Brinsley. The experience turned out to be one of my best at Lakeside. I had a blast playing a character who was scrambling in the dark trying to impress a famous art collector. It gave me a chance to explore a different side of myself, one that wasn't defined by coding. As I filled out my college applications, I put a bit of drama into the mix. To Princeton, I expressed interest in engineering and software. To Yale, I talked about politics and law. And to Harvard, I framed myself as someone interested in business or law. Each application was a new persona, a way to try on different futures. In the middle of this, I got a call from an executive at ISI who had helped us secure a project with the Bonneville Power Administration, BPA, which was working to modernize its power grid using computers. Paul and I, along with Rick, had been working on Trafo Data, a project to automate traffic data collection, but now we had a new opportunity. TRW, the contractor for the project, was desperate for PDP-10 experts, and that's where we came in. Paul, already disillusioned with school, took a leave of absence, and we both dove into the BPA project. When we arrived at BPA, I couldn't help but feel like I had entered the time tunnel. The high-tech control room was like something out of a sci-fi show. It was a massive operation managing the power grid of the Pacific Northwest, and we were tasked with computerizing the process of balancing supply and demand for electricity. We had to ensure that the system was running with 99.999% reliability, something I had never encountered before. I had always worked on projects that were important but didn't require perfection. This was different. At first, I was given simple tasks like documenting error messages, but soon they trusted us with more important work. I prided myself on my speed and work ethic, often working through the night, subsisting on tang and pizza. But one morning, I came in to find my code had been corrected by a programmer named John Norton. His feedback was thorough and sharp, and for the first time, I had to admit that my work wasn't as good as I thought. John, a seasoned programmer with a tragic past, he had worked on the Mariner 1 space probe that failed because of a small error, taught me what it truly meant to write flawless code. While I was at Bonneville, I received my acceptance letter to Harvard, along with offers from Yale and Princeton. Harvard was the obvious choice. But as I continued to work with Paul on Trafo Data and the schedule program, I found myself in a philosophical debate with him about our future. Paul saw collaboration as the key to success, while I envisioned breakthroughs coming from individuals working alone. That summer, we spent a lot of time together, working hard but also getting on each other's nerves. One day, after a heated argument, Paul wrote me a letter ending our partnership. He was frustrated with me and felt I wasn't respecting his ideas. I didn't sign the letter. I did leave to finish the scheduling project on my own. Eventually, Paul and I made up, and by the time I was at Harvard, we were back on good terms. That summer, after graduation, I spent my time working on Trafo Data while Paul and I debated our futures. The TRW engineers thought I was talented enough to skip college and go straight into graduate school, but I wasn't ready to abandon the idea of college. I wanted to see how I stacked up against other brilliant minds and expand my horizons. As I worked through the summer, Paul and I argued over the best approach to the scheduling program. Despite our differences, I realized that our partnership had always been about balancing our strengths and weaknesses. By the end of the summer, we had come to an understanding. I started my first year at Harvard, and Paul returned to Washington State University. We were back on track with Trafo data, and I had my first taste of what it meant to be part of a successful team, working on something larger than myself. Precocious, Harvard's Aiken Computation Laboratory received a decommissioned PDP-10 from Vietnam in the dead of night, a vivid example of how military funding had permeated computing. By the time I arrived as a freshman in 1973, many Boston-area technology companies had spun out from government-backed research and projects MIT. Cambridge itself was a high-tech centre, with Route 128 bustling before anyone used the term Silicon Valley. Inside the Aiken lab, the main attraction was the HARV-10, a PDP-10 loaded with Defense Department grants for advanced programming research. Graduate students worked on new languages, operating systems, and AI-based chemistry tools that displayed molecular structures on a screen. Nearby sat a D's PDP-1 from the early 1960s, once used for flight simulators and connected to other labs via ARPANET. I set my sights on combining these machines to create a three-dimensional baseball game, highly ambitious for an independent study project. Meanwhile, I settled into the usual freshman routines. I shared a dorm suite in Wigglesworth Hall with Sam from Montreal and Jim from Tennessee. Both were paying their way through different jobs, and that opened my eyes to how some people had to clean bathrooms for tuition. We joked around, but each of us had our own intense academic goals. I decided to tackle Math 55, a small class known for covering years of undergraduate math in just 2 semesters. The legendary John Mathel taught it, writing his own notes and expecting us to prove new theorems every week. By winter, only about 25 people remained. My close friends in Math 55 included Andy, who had already finished high school math years early, and Jim, whose parents both had scientific backgrounds. We spent long nights working on problem sets in their suite, discussing concepts from topology to finite-dimensional vector spaces. On Sunday nights, as we pushed to meet deadlines, we ran to Pinocchio's for congealing pizza and returned for more proofs until 2 or 3 in the morning. Although I kept up, it soon became clear that pure math might not be my ultimate path. Some classmates showed a flair for discovering entirely new approaches, whereas I thrived more on applying ideas than on creating foundational theorems. My academic schedule reflected that inner debate. I had tried organic chemistry, joining hundreds of pre-med students, only to skip most lectures and attempt to cram from videotaped sessions. That led to a C, my worst grade in college, but also a humbling lesson in discipline. On the computing side, I took graduate-level operating systems classes and discovered I still needed to rein in my brashness. I once stormed out of class after accusing the professor, an expert in queuing theory, of being completely wrong. Recognizing my own error, I apologized and learned a lesson in humility. Despite those challenges, I felt at home in the Aiken lab. Graduate students and other hackers had formed a cooperative culture around the HARV-10 and the older PDP-1. I spent countless hours there trying to perfect my baseball game simulation, though I never quite finished it. Another puzzle involved my future. Job offers began arriving. DC flew me out by helicopter to their headquarters. General Electric offered me a programming position in Kentucky. I politely declined them all. I wanted to prove I could get these offers, but I was not yet ready to abandon Harvard. Paul Allen, my friend and longtime collaborator, was also restless at Washington State University. I convinced him to look for work in Boston, hoping we could live near each other and plan a real venture around microprocessors. Eventually, Honeywell hired Paul, and in August 1974, he arrived with his girlfriend in a borrowed Plymouth, ready to start a new chapter. I returned to campus for my sophomore year, mindful that my time studying advanced math and building half-finished simulations was preparing me for something bigger. The pieces were all in motion, even though I could not yet see how they would come together. Wildcard. I have a recurring dream that still jolts me awake. I'm at Harvard. It's late in the semester, and I still haven't figured out where my class is meeting or which textbook I need. I'm wandering around in a panic, searching for the lecture hall or the final exam room, feeling like I've run out of time and I'll never get my act together. It's the feeling of cramming for finals at the last minute, and I can trace this anxiety back to my sophomore year. Back then, I had a habit of leaving everything until the final few weeks, hoping I could cram it all in. I skipped lectures and tried to learn everything by cramming in a short time. I decided to explore as much as I could at Harvard, thinking that by doubling my classes I would double my learning. I declared applied math as my major, seeing it as a wild card, an excuse to study anything I found interesting, from linguistics to criminal justice. It worked out perfectly for me. But the problem with cramming meant that come finals I had to hide away in Widener Library and study intensely for days on end. This led to a lifetime of dreams where I'm frantically searching for the classroom or the exam I missed. In the housing lottery that year, I ended up sharing a room with Andy. We were both slobs, which worked well. I also fell into a regular poker routine with a group of math and science students at Courier House. The game started with modest stakes but soon escalated as the smartest players, who calculated probabilities in their heads, raised the stakes. At first, I thought I was above average, but over time, I realised I wasn't good enough to keep up. My best night, I won about $1,800, but I lost nearly all of it the next night. Eventually, I recognised I wasn't cut out for gambling and stopped playing. Paul, who had taken a leave from college to work at Honeywell as a programmer, had moved into a small apartment in the suburbs of Boston with his girlfriend Rita. He'd become a bit of a legend to my college friends, who saw him as a cool older brother figure. One weekend, I visited Paul and we ended up doing LSD while watching Kung Fu. The experience led to some strange thoughts, like wondering if I could somehow erase all my memories, until I realised that was a terrible idea. While working at Honeywell, Paul was also fascinated by the potential of microprocessors, particularly the Intel 8080 chip. He started pitching ideas to me about starting a computer company similar to Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, which had revolutionized the computer industry by creating cheaper, more accessible machines. Paul's idea was to build a powerful computer by connecting several cheap microprocessors. I studied the IBM System 360, a massively expensive mainframe, and realized we might be able to build something similar for a fraction of the cost. At the same time, I was dealing with the frustrations of our Trafo Data project. Our partner, Paul Gilbert, was struggling to make the hardware work, which only deepened my reluctance to dive into hardware. The hardware issues seemed endless, full of glitches and failures, and it was hard to keep pushing forward. But the potential of software still intrigued me, and Paul was constantly bringing up new ideas. One of the most promising was the possibility of writing a new kind of software for an emerging market, the personal computer. The Altair 8800, a kit-based computer powered by the Intel 8080 chip, was advertised in Popular Electronics in January 1975. It was a game changer. The Altair would allow individuals to have access to a full computer system for the first time, and it could be powered by the very chip Paul and I had been studying. We didn't have an Altair or even an 8080 chip, but Paul had a solution. He had developed a simulator that could make a powerful mainframe computer, a PDP-10, behave like an Altair. With that in mind, we set out to write a version of BASIC, a programming language that was user-friendly enough for hobbyists to use on the Altair. We worked nights at the Harvard lab, Paul refining his simulator and me writing code. We had our doubts, but when Paul called Emts, the company behind the Altair, and introduced our BASIC program, they seemed interested, but they didn't believe we had a working version of it yet. So we scrambled. One night, Paul and I realized we had forgotten a small piece of code to load the program, a bootstrap loader, but Paul quickly wrote it out on the plane. When we finally reached Emts, we were nervous but hopeful. We got the Altair running, fed the tape with our BASIC program into the machine, and after a tense moment, the first response appeared on the screen. Memory size? Paul typed in a few commands, and the machine responded with the correct output. Our program worked. This was the first piece of software ever written for the first personal computer. It was a breakthrough marking the beginning of a new era in computing. Be so correct. I don't know who was more surprised, me or them. Paul laughed, reflecting on the moment when our software successfully ran on the Altair. When the machine printed out the result of 2 plus 2, Ed Roberts, the president of MIT, and Bill Yates, the lead engineer, were stunned. Paul was amazed too, but it was a pivotal moment that showed our little program worked flawlessly from the start. After the basic math test, Paul decided to show them more. He typed in a version of Lunar Lander from 101 Basic Computer Games, a simple text-based game we had learned to program at Lakeside. It worked on the first try. Ed was thrilled. He immediately invited Paul to his office to discuss business. It turned out that MIT was a small company that had been struggling financially. Ed had started MIT in the late 1960s, making transmitters for model airplanes and later moving to calculator kits. But with the rise of competition and a weak economy, MIT had been on the brink of collapse. When Intel released the 8080 microprocessor, Ed saw a chance to turn things around by creating a cheap, functional computer. He gambled everything, borrowing money to finance the Altair. At first there was no prototype. MIT had pitched the Altair to Popular Electronics magazine with nothing but a cardboard mock-up. But when the magazine featured it, the orders poured in, and MIT was overwhelmed with demand. That was when Ed wanted to license our BASIC interpreter, knowing it would be the key to turning the Altair into a useful computer. We discussed the terms, and soon Paul and I realized we needed a name for our partnership. We were still using Trafo Data for formal letters, but we wanted something more fitting for the new business. I suggested Allen & Gates Consulting, but it sounded too much like a law firm. Paul came up with Microsoft, combining microcomputer and software. It was perfect. Around that time, I was told by Eric Roberts, a friend at Harvard, to stop using the school's PDP-10 for our commercial project. The lab had been funded by the Department of Defense for research purposes, and using it for commercial work wasn't allowed. Eric's warning led me to find another place to run our software, and soon after, Paul accepted a job at MIT, moving to New Mexico to work as their director of software development. With the Altair's orders coming in fast, MIT published a newsletter for its growing community of users. The first issue of Computer Notes featured our basic program, even though it was far from finished. We hadn't signed a contract with MIT yet, and the software was still being tested. But the public knew about it now, and demand was growing. Then one morning, I got a call from the associate director of the Aiken lab. I knew this was about my use of the computer. When I met with him, he confronted me about spending too much time in the lab and working on a commercial project. I explained what I was doing, but it was clear I had broken the rules. The government funding for the lab was at stake, and he was concerned about the unauthorized use of the computer. The situation escalated quickly. I was summoned to the administrative board at Harvard, which could expel me for breaking the rules. I hadn't told my parents much about my work with Paul and the Altair, but now I had to explain everything to them. My father, logical and calm, helped me navigate the situation. He even called Harvard to make sure the process was fair. I spent a long night writing a letter to the administrative board, apologizing for my mistakes, explaining my actions, and asking for a second chance. I emphasized that I had made a mistake, but hoped it wouldn't ruin my future. In the letter, I also made it clear that Monte, who was just a freshman and had been involved in the project, shouldn't be punished. I acknowledged that I was responsible for bringing him into the lab. The following week, I received the news. The board had decided to admonish me, meaning I wouldn't face severe punishment. I had violated the rule of bringing unauthorized people into the lab, but the board recognized that the lab had little oversight at the time. Monte was cleared of all charges. In the midst of all this, I continued to work on Microsoft with Paul, outlining the next steps for our negotiations with MIT and planning for future projects. Our company was gaining momentum, but my Harvard troubles weren't over yet. In the end, I was lucky. The board's decision spared me from more serious consequences, and I was able to continue my studies. The tension over my use of the Aiken lab was a reflection of the times. Computing resources were still scarce and access was tightly controlled. But the arrival of the Altair marked the beginning of a new era in computing, one where personal computers would soon be in millions of homes, and the idea of a teenager creating software of value would become commonplace. The cost of computing would drop dramatically, and the technology would change the world forever. Microsoft. When I arrived in Albuquerque in the summer of 1975, the scene at MIT was chaotic. What had once been a sandwich shop now resembled a makeshift computer factory. Employees scrambled to meet the unexpected demand for the Altair, the $400 mail-order computer. Customers, eager for their new gadget, would even camp out in RVs at the corner of Lynn Avenue and California Street, waiting for their Altair to be delivered as if it were a pizza. MT's, in a strip mall surrounded by a check-cashing place and a laundromat, became ground zero for the personal computer revolution. Ed Roberts, the visionary behind MT's, had underestimated the demand. He'd initially forecast just 800 customers, but orders poured in from thousands. The Altair's buyers, engineers, doctors, students, and hobbyists didn't care that it had no software, keyboard, or display. They were excited by the opportunity to own a computer, even one that could only flick switches and make lights blink. In Menlo Park, California, a group of hobbyists called the Homebrew Computer Club had gathered, and one of them had even driven to Albuquerque to see if MITS was real. When he met Ed, he learned that MITS had taken far more orders than it could handle. By the next meeting, the group saw an Altair in action. A carpenter named Steve Dompier toggled in a simple program that made the Altair play Fool on the Hill by the Beatles through an AM radio, followed by Daisy Daisy, the first song ever played on a computer back in 1957. The Homebrew Club's membership quickly grew into the hundreds, and clubs like it began to sprout up around the country. These early adopters, like myself, had always thought of computers as costly, large, and out of reach. But now, for under $1,000, anyone could own a computer, even if it didn't do much. To fuel the enthusiasm, Ed loaded his blue Dodge camper van, the Blue Goose, with Altairs and took them on a road trip to meet hobbyists in US cities. The Blue Goose became an iconic part of the Altair experience. In June 1975, I flew to San Francisco to join the Blue Goose and visit the Homebrew Club. This was my first trip to Silicon Valley, and it was an eye-opener. Many hobbyists saw personal computers through the lens of counterculture. Cheap computers symbolized a victory of the masses against corporate control of technology. Some of these enthusiasts, like the People's Computer Company, were using computers to offer free education to kids. The ethos of the time was that computing should be for the people, not for profit. While in California, we demonstrated the Altair at Ricky's Hyatt House in Palo Alto. This is when things took a surprising turn. During the demonstration, someone in the crowd swiped a copy of the 4K BASIC code we had written. The tape made its way to a homebrew member who made dozens of copies, distributing them at meetings. Within weeks, copies of our BASIC were circulating freely, weeks before we had finished the version we planned to sell. In the early days of personal computing, the idea that software could be free was widely accepted. People shared software like they shared music. But Paul and I had bigger plans. We wanted to build a business. We believed that as personal computers became cheaper, there would be massive demand for quality software. As we worked on BASIC, we began talking about other products we could develop, from programming tools to operating systems. We had a vision of Microsoft becoming a software factory, providing the best products for personal computers. At the time, the idea of a software company was almost unheard of. Companies like Intel, Motorola, and Fairchild were dominating the chip market, and everyone knew that hardware was tangible, something you could hold in your hands. But software was intangible, stored on magnetic tape or paper, and many people didn't see why it should be sold. Despite these challenges, we had our first customer, MITS. In late July, we signed a contract with them. It paid us $3,000 up front and included royalties for every copy of BASIC sold with an Altair. We also agreed to write versions for other microprocessors, including Motorola's 6800. The contract was a big deal for us, but it came with challenges. As Ed pushed forward with new versions of the Altair, we found ourselves working late into the night, writing code, fixing bugs and testing new versions of BASIC. Our first home in Albuquerque was a shared room at the Sundowner Motor Hotel, and later we rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex called Portals. We didn't have much, but we had our work. Paul worked full-time at Emites while I handled much of the business side of things for Microsoft. By September, Rick, a former co-worker from Lakeside, joined us to help with coding. Our days were consumed with writing code for BASIC and planning the next steps for Microsoft. We had no real office and no real resources, but we were determined. We were managing everything: programming, legal matters, payroll, and even marketing. We knew we had a lot to learn, but we had the drive and the vision. In December 1975, I realized that our royalties were much lower than expected. Less than 10% of Altair owners had bought BASIC, and pirated versions were flooding the market. I felt strongly that this issue needed to be addressed, so I wrote an open letter to the hobbyist community, urging people to pay for software. The response was divided. Some agreed with me, while others criticized me for attacking the community. Ed Roberts was furious when he read my letter, and I was forced to write a second letter offering a more diplomatic explanation. That letter marked a turning point for Microsoft. We were suddenly thrust into the spotlight, and the debate about software piracy took center stage. Despite the controversy, we continued to grow. In the spring of 1976, we hired our first full-time employee, Mark McDonald. Rick also decided to rejoin the company, and we set up a partnership to run the business. The future was uncertain, but we were more determined than ever to succeed. Source code. In the summer of 1976, Businessweek published an article titled "Microcomputers Catch On Fast," which highlighted the rapid rise of personal computers. The piece drew attention to MIT's, which had sold 8,000 Altair computers, bringing in $3.5 million in revenue. The article made it clear that, while competitors existed, the Altair was the dominant machine at the time. However, I knew this lead wouldn't last forever. Big companies, especially the likes of IBM and Texas Instruments, could easily step into the personal computer space and outpace Emites, something Ed Roberts, the founder of Emites, feared deeply. Ed, tired of the daily headaches of managing the company, was struggling to handle the growing demands of MITS, now a company of over 200 employees. At Microsoft, we were still reliant on MITS for most of our revenue, primarily through royalties from the 8080 BASIC software we had developed. While these royalties were growing, they weren't enough to sustain our ambitions. We were starting to feel the pressure of being tied to MX and began considering ways to become more independent. Rick, who had been our general manager, had a change of heart and opted out of the partnership, choosing instead to lead a more balanced life. This left Paul and me to continue the work on Microsoft, and we adopted more formal business titles. I became the president and Paul was the VP. Rick, though no longer a partner, remained a close friend and helped us keep things running. We were working on expanding Microsoft's offerings. BASIC had been our flagship product, but we realized it wasn't enough to reach the broader market. We started developing versions of other important programming languages like Fortran and COBOL, targeting different customer segments. We also began to hire outside talent like Steve Wood to help build out these new products. That summer, I decided to focus on developing APL, a language that was popular among serious programmers but not yet widely available for personal computers. I spent weeks writing the code in my parents' house, paying for dial-up charges to access a portable terminal. Meanwhile, I started to feel the strain of balancing Microsoft with my studies at Harvard. I loved the intellectual stimulation of college, but Microsoft was starting to demand my full attention. In January 1978, I made the decision to drop out of Harvard and focus entirely on Microsoft. While I was navigating this shift, Microsoft's financial situation was becoming increasingly dire. We were dealing with unpaid royalties from MITs and a series of unfulfilled licensing deals. To make matters worse, Rick had left the company and our cash flow was slow. We were getting desperate, but things began to change after we signed deals with companies like Texas Instruments and Apple. In the spring of 1977, I attended the West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco, where I met Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Apple was showcasing the Apple II, a sleek, consumer-friendly personal computer. This was the first encounter in what would become a long relationship with Apple, marked by both cooperation and rivalry. Apple was using the MOS Technology 6502 chip, which was the same chip we were developing BASIC for, and they were interested in licensing our software. This opened the door to more opportunities and signaled the beginning of Apple's rise in the personal computer market. By late 1977, we had also secured deals with companies like Commodore and Radio Shack, whose TRS-80 computer was gaining traction. These new products were pushing personal computers into schools, offices, and homes, making computing more accessible to the general public. We were no longer just selling software to hobbyists. We were becoming a key player in a much larger industry. However, our relationship with MITs continued to sour. They were blocking our licensing deals they made, and we were eventually forced to take them to arbitration. After a tense and drawn-out battle, we won the case, and MIMITS was forced to pay up for the royalties it owed. This victory allowed Microsoft to finally break free from MITS and move forward with more independent projects. By the end of 1977, the personal computer industry had solidified its place in the mainstream. The three key players, the Commodore PET, Apple II, and Radio Shack TRS-80, were taking personal computers to new heights. Our software was embedded in all of these machines, marking a significant milestone in Microsoft's growth. As we looked toward the future, it became clear that we needed to move to a new location. While Albuquerque had served us well, we were outgrowing it. I proposed moving Microsoft's headquarters to Seattle, where the proximity to top universities and the tech industry would offer new opportunities. By late 1978, we had made the decision to leave Albuquerque behind, signaling the next phase of Microsoft's evolution. Epilogue. My mother and grandmother always dreamed of having a place on Hood Canal where our growing family could gather as we all started our own families. Unfortunately, Gami passed away in 1987 before she could see that dream come to fruition. On the day of her memorial, my parents, Libby, Christy and I, drove out to look at a piece of land that Gami had found for us. I ended up buying it, and in the following years we built a set of cottages. My mom called it Gateway, and it became a sanctuary during the intense and often chaotic early years of Microsoft. It became a place of personal refuge for me. I began a tradition there which I called Think Week. Once or twice a year I would spend 7 uninterrupted days out there, whether by car or taking a seaplane, where I would dive into books, articles and papers to learn whatever I felt was important for Microsoft's future. It was during these times that I would write long strategy memos focused on areas like internet security, natural language processing, and how we could stay ahead in the tech world. As Gami and my mom had hoped, Gateway became a hub for our extended family, a place where we would meet every 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and many times throughout the year. As our family grew, it became a spot where my children and their cousins continued the traditions that had been passed down from Gami. Fast forward to our 4th of July gathering in 2012. The seaplane dropped me off near the resort by our place. As I stepped onto the dock, I heard someone call my name. I looked up and saw Marvin Evans, Kent's father. It had been about 20 years since we had last met. Marvin and Kent's brother, David, were on a short sailing trip and had docked for the night. We sat on the deck of their boat and caught up. Marvin, now in his 80s, spoke with that familiar, soothing southern drawl, taking me back to the days when he would drive Kent and me around Seattle in his old '67 Dodge. He had been working on his memoirs, including stories about Kent and me and the Lakeside Programming Group. Marvin laughed when I recited the Evans family phone number, which I still remembered. We both agreed that Kent would have been amazed to see where our shared passion for programming had taken us. The boy who once wondered if $15 million could even fit in a car would have been astonished to know that the skills we developed at Lakeside would contribute to one of the most successful companies in history, and that the software we created would touch almost every aspect of modern life. Looking back, I'm not usually the nostalgic type, but there are days when I wish I could be 13 again, making that promise to myself that if I just kept moving forward, learning more and understanding better, I could create something truly useful. Success stories often simplify the people in them. The genius engineer, the boy wonder, the paradoxical tycoon. But for me, it's been a series of unique circumstances, many beyond my control, that have shaped who I am and my career. It's important to acknowledge the unearned privilege I had being born in the United States, born white, and being male in a society that disproportionately advantages those characteristics. But I also had incredibly lucky timing. I was a rebellious child at Acorn Academy, just as engineers were figuring out how to create semiconductor chips, setting the stage for the personal computing revolution. By the time I started programming at 13, entire computer systems could be fit onto a single chip. The tech world was evolving, and I was right there, ready to take advantage of it. My head for math played a crucial role in my development. I read mathematician Jordan Ellenberg's book, How Not to Be Wrong, where he compares mathematics to a pair of X-ray specs, revealing hidden structures beneath the chaotic surface of the world. That helped me see the order in things and solidified my confidence. It gave me security in the belief that there was always a solution waiting to be found. I spent my early 30s watching videos of Richard Feynman teaching physics. Feynman's absolute mastery over his subject and his ability to make complex concepts feel approachable fascinated me. His joy for finding new things, as he described in The Meaning of It All, resonated deeply with me. That feeling of uncovering mysteries and deriving pleasure from solving problems became part of my drive. From my early coding days at Lakeside to working at C-Cubed and TRW, I was always driven by curiosity. Software was the perfect outlet for that intellectual energy. The need for learning and discovery propelled me forward, especially at the beginning of the personal computer revolution. But curiosity alone isn't enough. It requires support, guidance, and the right environment. When Dr. Cressy told me I was a lucky kid, he was recognizing the advantages I had, including being born into a family that understood how to support my development. If I were growing up today, I'd likely be diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Back then, there wasn't much understanding of how differently some people's brains process information. My parents didn't have a roadmap for dealing with a son who could become obsessed with projects, miss social cues, or be unaware of how his actions affected others. Still, they knew how to guide me with a balance of support and pressure. They didn't let me retreat inward. They pushed me out into the world, whether through sports or family gatherings. This exposure to different perspectives and ideas fueled my curiosity about the world. My parents' influence was profound. While I inherited my father's confidence, I absorbed my mother's expectation to not just succeed, but to do something meaningful. She would often remind me that wealth came with the responsibility to give it away, a lesson that I've tried to live by. My mother passed away in 1994, but in the years after, my father helped establish the foundation we run today, bringing the same compassion that had defined his legal career. As I look back more these days, piecing together memories, I realise how much of who I am was there from the beginning. I'm still that child at Gamey's table, eagerly trying to make sense of the world. That spirit of curiosity and anticipation still drives me, even after all the years and learning.